wagon rocked hard over the broken road, and every jolt hit Adeline Voss like a slap. She held the marriage contract in both hands. The ink was still soft from her own signature, smudged now from the sweat on her palms. 19 years old, no mother, no father, no home to go back to. The textile mill where she'd worked in Boston had burned to the ground 3 weeks ago, and everything she once called a future had burned with it. She had stood in the ashes outside that mill and asked herself one question. Was there anyone left in the world who needed her? The answer came in the form of a torn advertisement and a stranger's name. Ezra Caldwell. She didn't know what he looked like. She didn't know if he was kind or cruel, young or old, if he would greet her with a smile or with the flat stare of a man collecting an order he'd placed. She only knew that every turn of the wagon wheel carried her further from the woman she used to be. The mountains rose higher on both sides of the road and quieter. No more houses, no more smoke from chimneys, just wind and rock and a gray sky pressing down low like it wanted to swallow her whole. She did not know if she was riding toward a home or dragging herself toward a grave made of ice. 20 miles up, on a ridge called Blackwood, Ezra Caldwell gripped the handle of his axe. 10 years. 10 years since he'd heard another voice besides the wind through the rocks and his own breath in the dark. 10 years since he buried Sarah under the old pine behind the cabin. A fever had taken her in 3 days. He had never once let the weeds grow over that small mound of earth. He had learned one thing, and learned it well. What you don't love can't betray you. The mountain never promised him anything. It was cold, it was hard, but at least it was honest. In the bottom drawer of an old wooden chest, a ring sat wrapped in cloth, gathering dust. The one thing he couldn't throw away, the one thing he couldn't look at either. He had no idea that right now a wagon was climbing the road below his cabin, carrying the one thing he'd sworn 10 years ago never to let through his door again. A beating heart. The first snow of the storm began to fall. Slow, heavy flakes, like the sky itself was holding its breath. 2 people, 2 wounds, 2 promises, moving closer to each other by the minute, and neither one knew that the storm coming for them was more than snow. The wagon broke into the clearing just as the wind picked up. Ezra heard the bells before he saw it. Harness bells, out of season, on a day no mail rider or trader had business being this high. He wiped grease from his hands onto a rag and watched the wagon fight its way through the drifts toward his porch. The driver climbed down with a grunt. Garrett. Ezra knew him from Oakhaven, the town down in the valley, though he hadn't laid eyes on him in over a year. "Thorne, Caldwell, got a delivery for you," Garrett called out, his voice rough from the cold. "I didn't order anything," Ezra said. Garrett didn't answer. He walked around to the back of the wagon and held out his hand. A woman stepped down, stiff and slow from the long ride. She wore a wool coat too thin for mountain weather and a plain bonnet that half hid her face. Ezra felt his chest go tight. "What is this?" he said. "Your bride," Garrett said, pulling a folded letter from his coat pocket. "Paid in full. Papers signed. Address matches." The woman looked up. Her eyes were a pale hazel, and there was something steady in them, even with the fear underneath. "I'm Adeline," she said, her voice barely carried over the wind. Ezra took the letter with a hand that wasn't quite steady. Inside was handwriting he hadn't seen in years. His brother's. "Ezra, you're rotting up there. I used what was left of Father's money to find you someone who can fix that. Don't be a fool twice in one life. Thomas." Ezra felt the anger come up fast, blurring the edges of his sight. "There's been a mistake," he said, turning to Adeline. "I didn't ask for this. I don't want this." She flinched like he'd struck her. Her hands tightened around the handle of a small, worn suitcase. "The driver was paid to bring me here," she said. Her voice shook but held. "I have no home to go back to, Mr. Caldwell." Garrett was already climbing back onto his bench. "That's between the two of you now," he said. "Snow's coming down hard. I've got to make the pass before it closes." The wagon turned before Ezra could say another word. He watched it disappear into the gray, the last thread to the outside world pulling away with it. He looked at Adeline, standing alone in the clearing, snow catching in her eyelashes. "I can't take you in," he said. The words felt hollow even as he said them. "Then I'll freeze," she said simply. The first heavy flakes of the storm started coming down, fat and wet. Ezra let out a long breath that turned to fog in front of him. "Get inside," he muttered, and turned toward the cabin. Her boots crunched behind him in the snow. The first woman's footsteps to cross that threshold in 10 years. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs and gun oil. It was a man's space, plain, worn, nothing soft about it. Ezra pointed to a chair by the hearth. "Sit. Warm up." He built up the fire while she sat with her suitcase at her feet, watching him with those quiet eyes. "I don't have a spare bed," he said, not looking at her. "You'll take the cot in the loft." "Thank you," she said. He went to the stove and threw a chunk of dried venison and a few shriveled potatoes into a pot. The silence between them was heavy, full of things neither one wanted to say yet. "Why'd you come?" he asked finally, his back still to her. "A woman doesn't sign her life to a stranger for no reason." There was a long pause before she answered. "I was a mill worker in Boston. The building burned down. No family, no savings, and the landlord was at my door. Your brother's advertisement promised a life with purpose." She paused. "He didn't say you were a man who hated the world." Ezra turned around. "I don't hate the world. I just prefer it without people in it." "And yet here I am," she said, a flicker of something sharp in her face. "For now," Ezra said. "Come spring thaw, once the trail's clear, I'm sending you back." Adeline looked down at her chapped hands. "Spring is a long way off, Mr. Caldwell." That night the storm hit the cabin hard. Ezra lay on his bed downstairs, listening to the timbers creak and to the soft sound of Adeline moving above him. 10 years alone had made another person's presence feel like something pressing on his skin. He thought about his brother's letter and the anger of it. He thought about Sarah and how her leaving had turned something in his chest to stone. By morning, 3 feet of snow covered the valley. Ezra woke to a smell he hadn't known in years. Something cooking. He found a plate of fried dough and salted pork waiting on the table, and Adeline at the window, scraping frost off the glass with her fingernail. "I used what was in the pantry," she said without turning around. "Hope you don't mind." He sat down, hungrier than he wanted to admit, and took a bite. "Better than my cooking," he said grudgingly. "That's not saying much, I imagine," she said, a small smile at the corner of her mouth. The weeks that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. Ezra spent his days outside, chopping wood, checking his traps, working until his arms ached, anything to keep from being in the small cabin with her. But every evening he came back to a house that was slowly changing. Adeline scrubbed years of soot from the walls. She found scraps of cloth and mended his torn shirts. She reorganized his tool shelf, though he grumbled that he couldn't find a thing. He caught himself watching her when she wasn't looking. The way firelight caught in her hair, the strength in her small hands, the way she never once complained about the cold or the silence or him. Some mornings he'd wake to find she'd already been up an hour, boots by the door dusted with fresh snow from checking the traps he'd shown her once, just so he wouldn't have to go out before the coffee was hot. She never made a thing of it. She'd just nod toward the kettle and go back to whatever she was mending. He started noticing small things he hadn't before, that she hummed under her breath when she thought he wasn't listening, that she always left the last piece of cornbread on the plate for him, no matter how little there was, that she flinched just slightly every time he raised his voice, though she never once backed down from him. He didn't know what to do with any of it, so mostly he said nothing and split more wood than the cabin could ever burn. A letter came with the next supply run, carried up by a boy Thomas had hired out of Oakhaven since Garrett wasn't due again for weeks. Ezra read it standing on the porch, snow still falling around him. Ezra, hope she made it up all right. Ma sends flour and salt pork with the boy. Write back if you want to yell at me. I can take it. Thomas. Ezra didn't write back, but he didn't throw the letter in the fire either. He folded it and put it in the drawer next to the ring. One evening, with the wind rattling the shutters, Ezra found Adeline by the fire holding a book he hadn't opened in years. "You can read," he said, sitting across from her to sharpen his knife. "My father was a school teacher," she said. "He taught me that books are the only way to travel when you're stuck in one place." She looked up at him. "Why are you so afraid of me, Ezra?" The sound of his first name caught him off guard. "I'm not afraid of you," he said sharply. "You are," she said gently. "You're afraid I'll make you want things you worked hard to forget." Ezra stood, his chair scraping the floor. "I'm going to check the barn." "It's midnight," she called after him. "The horses are fine." He didn't answer. Outside, the cold hit him like a shock, and he stood there looking up at the stars. She was right. That was the worst part of it. A week later, the mountain reminded them both what it could do. A branch, heavy with ice, snapped off a pine and crashed through the roof of the lean-to where Ezra kept his winter grain. He was outside when it happened. The sound was like a gunshot. Adeline ran to the door, face pale. "Ezra, are you hurt?" He was already digging through the wreckage. "The grain's exposed. Help me move the sacks." For 3 hours they worked side by side in the cold. Adeline didn't stop, hauling sacks that must have weighed half what she did, her breath coming hard, until the last of the grain was safe inside. When they finally stopped, they stood in the middle of the room, covered in snow, shivering. "You didn't have to do that," Ezra said, his voice softer than she'd heard it. "I'm part of this house now," she said, teeth chattering, "whether you want me here or not." He reached out and let his hand rest on her shoulder. Then he pulled a heavy fur rug around both of them and sat with her by the fire. For the first time, the quiet between them wasn't tense. It was something else. "I had a wife once," Ezra said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Her name was Sarah. We had a small place down in the valley. We were going to build a life." He swallowed hard. "A fever took her. 3 days, and everything I cared about was gone. I came up here because the mountain doesn't promise you anything. It can't break your heart. It never claimed to love you." Adeline reached under the fur and took his hand. "The mountain doesn't love you, Ezra, but it doesn't live for you either," she said. "You've been a ghost in your own house." He looked down at their joined hands. "Maybe I have." The days after that felt different. Ezra started teaching her to shoot, standing behind her with his hands guiding her elbows, showing her how to breathe out slow before she pulled the trigger. She hit the fence post on her 3rd try and turned to him with a grin so wide he had to look away. "Where'd a mill girl learn to hold a rifle steady like that?" he asked. "I didn't," she said. "I had a good teacher." She taught him to hum while he worked, something small and wordless she'd carry through the cabin while she swept or mended, and one evening he caught himself doing it too, out at the woodpile, and stopped himself, embarrassed, before he noticed she was watching from the window, smiling. In the evenings, they traded pieces of their old lives, her childhood in the city, the sound of the mill floor, the games she used to play with the other girls on their one Sunday off, and his years on the mountain, the winter he'd nearly lost 2 fingers to frostbite, the elk he'd tracked for 3 days one October just to prove to himself he still could. One afternoon, needing more firewood room, Adeline opened a door at the back of the cabin she'd never gone through. Inside was a small room, untouched, a narrow bed, a folded quilt, a hairbrush still sitting on a shelf. She didn't know it had been Sarah's. She started tidying it, the same way she'd tidied everything else in the house, without thinking twice. Ezra came in from the woodpile and found her there, dustcloth in hand, the quilt half folded. "What are you doing?" he said. His voice had gone cold. "I was just—" She stopped when she saw his face. "I didn't know." "Get out of there," he said. "Now." She left the room without a word. He stood in the doorway a long moment, staring at the space, then shut the door harder than he meant to. Adeline didn't speak to him for the rest of that day. That night she found him sitting alone by the dying fire. "I wasn't trying to erase her," she said quietly. "I didn't know that room meant something." Ezra rubbed his face with both hands. "It's not your fault. I never told you." He was quiet a moment. "I kept that room shut because as long as nothing in it moved, it felt like she hadn't really gone." "She has gone, Ezra," Adeline said, not unkindly. "But you're still here, and so am I." He looked at her for a long time before he answered. "I know." He didn't ask her to leave the room as she'd fixed it. In the days after, he didn't go back in either. But something between them had shifted, not broken, just opened a little wider. Late in February, with the days growing longer and something like ease settling between them, Ezra spent an evening in the barn instead of the cabin. Adeline assumed he was working late. She went to bed without thinking much of it. In the morning, he was gone before she woke, but a note sat on the table in his rough handwriting. "Building something. Don't come looking." He worked through the day and into the next, hauling planks up from the shed, sawing late into the night by lamplight. When he finally called her out to the barn, she found a small table built into the corner near the window, sized just for a sewing basket, angled so the afternoon light would fall across it. "Thought you could use a proper place to work," he said, not quite looking at her, "instead of hunching over the kitchen table like you've been doing." Adeline ran her hand along the wood. It wasn't fancy. It was steady and square and built with care. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I wanted to," Ezra said. It was the first time he'd said those words to her about anything. Then, on a day of sudden thaw followed by a hard freeze, Ezra went out to check his high traps and didn't come back by dark. Adeline had been packing that same morning. Garrett's wagon was due any day now with a spring thaw, and Ezra hadn't said a word about wanting her to stay. She told herself it was foolish to hope for more than he'd offered. She folded her few dresses into the suitcase Miller had first carried up the mountain and set it by the door. When the light started to fade and Ezra still hadn't returned, she stood at the window watching the tree line, the suitcase forgotten behind her. By full dark, she couldn't wait any longer. She took his old rifle down from the wall and a coil of rope from the barn, pulled on her coat, and went out into the freezing night, following his tracks up the ridge. She found him an hour later, half buried in snow where the ground had given way beneath him, his leg caught and broken between 2 rocks. His face was gray with pain and cold. "Ezra, answer me!" He forced out a ragged shout, and she slid down the embankment to him, her eyes wide when she saw the state of his leg. "You shouldn't have come," he gasped. "It's too dangerous." "Shut up, Ezra Caldwell," she snapped, already working the rope into a splint. "You are not leaving me that easily." It took hours. She built a drag sled from the rope and a fallen branch and hauled him through the snow, her hands bleeding, her breath tearing at her chest, refusing to stop even when her legs shook under the weight of him. When they finally reached the cabin, she pulled him inside and sank to the floor beside him, spent. Ezra looked at her through the pain, and something in his chest gave way completely. She had saved him, not just from the mountain, but from the 10 years he'd spent burying himself alive on it. The weeks that followed, his legs slowly mending, Adeline tended him without complaint. She cooked, she cleaned, she sat by his bed reading from the books they'd both come to love. She changed the dressing on his leg every morning without flinching, even on the days it looked worse before it looked better. At night, when the pain kept him from sleeping, she'd sit on the edge of the bed and talk quietly about nothing in particular. The shape of the clouds that day, a story her father used to tell, until his breathing finally slowed. He watched her more closely in those weeks than he ever had. The care in her hands, the patience she never seemed to run out of, even when he was short-tempered with the pain. He thought about the suitcase he'd found by the door the night of the accident, still packed, and never asked her about it. He didn't need to. She'd left it unpacked in the corner for a week before quietly putting her things back on the shelf, and he'd said nothing, only noticed and been grateful. The anger he'd carried toward his brother had long since faded, replaced by something closer to gratitude. One afternoon, wagon wheels sounded in the clearing. The trails had finally opened. Garrett pulled up, his wagon loaded with supplies bound for the mining camps further up. "Caldwell, still alive up here?" he called. Ezra limped onto the porch with a cane he'd carved himself. Adeline stood beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "Still alive," Ezra said. "Got a letter for the lady," Garrett said, tossing a small envelope onto the porch steps. "And there's room in the back, if she's ready to head down like you said she would, come spring." Adeline's hand tightened on Ezra's arm. He looked down at her, saw the question in her eyes, and thought of everything the winter had built between them. He turned back to Garrett. "She's not going anywhere," Ezra said, his voice steady and loud enough to carry. Garrett grinned. "Figured as much. Your brother owes me $5. As the wagon pulled away, Adeline let out a small laugh. "He bet on us?" "Everyone bets on this mountain," Ezra said, pulling her close. "I think they underestimated the woman who came up here to fight it." He kissed her then, and it tasted like wood smoke and pine and a future he'd never let himself imagine. By early summer, Adeline had turned a patch of thawed ground near the porch into a small garden, the first green shoots pushing up through the dark soil. Ezra had started building things, a proper wardrobe to replace her suitcase, a rocking chair for the porch, a bookshelf for the growing pile of books they read together at night. He wrote back to Thomas that summer, a short letter, plainer than anything he'd said out loud. "Thomas, you were right, and I was a fool. Thank you for the meddling, and for the $5 you're about to lose." He never went back to keeping the door to Sarah's old room shut. By midsummer, it had become a small pantry, shelves lined with the jars Adeline had put up from the garden. A room used again, instead of a room kept sealed, like a wound. He'd walk past it now without his jaw tightening, and some days he'd even smile, thinking how much Sarah, wherever she was, might have liked the woman who'd finally opened that door. The mountain still roared at night when the wind came through, but the sound didn't feel lonely anymore. It felt like something closer to peace. One evening, Adeline sat on the porch, her head against Ezra's shoulder, watching deer move through the tree line. "It's quiet here," she said, "but it's a full kind of quiet now." Ezra covered her hand with his. "It's the kind of quiet that lets a man hear himself think." "And what are you thinking, Ezra Caldwell?" "That I'm a lucky man," he said. "The luckiest one on this mountain." She smiled and turned her eyes back to the garden and the deer and the light going soft and gold over the ridge. A bride he had never ordered, and the only thing, in the end, he had ever needed.